Yeah.
Okay, Barry, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, thanks very much, John, for all of that. Just two very short notices before we start. I'm sure you know, I'm sure it's in your diary already, but the next Zoom, BTA Zoom, is on the 16th of November. 16th of November, and it's Mark talking about polar orchids, which seems rather interesting. And could I also mention the Yardingly show at the end of October from memory? It's the BTA one frame competition, and I'm sure Andrew would appreciate some more entries. It's always good fun, and it's a good show as well. Right, having said that, as mentioned earlier on, we've got 7 speakers. John and I have rehearsed this ruthlessly about 3 minutes ago. So what I'm going to do is just mention who it is and roughly what they're talking about, if I can pronounce it. And we'll take it from there. Then when they have finished, we'll move on to the second one, etc. If I announce somebody's name as an almighty screen, I think you can take it as read they weren't expecting to do any talking this evening. But so hopefully I'll get them in the right order and I've got the right names. So without further ado, Andrew, I think you are up, and I can't read what your title is because I put my wrong glasses on, but never mind. It's all yours.
Fine. Let's have the first slide, please. Okay, so the title is duralumin. It also goes under lots of other variations of dur and aluminium, but it's something that you've all used, and you've probably never heard of it, but you will possibly be benefiting it from at some time in the future or in the past, particularly if you've ever flown in an aeroplane. Next slide. So this is a wormhole that I've been going down recently with some interest, but ultimately, you know, the wormhole has come to an end. I exhibited my copper, you know, 5-frame exhibit last year in the Czech Republic, and the judges gave me a lot of time because there were very few other entrants who'd bothered to turn up. So then they told me that they didn't like this Airbus proof. Well, it's one of those publicity proofs, really, from the French Postal Service. So they said, yeah, interesting story there about the amount of wire which is used in aeroplanes and how it's evolved, and you know that the aluminium, we now use aluminium wire in Airbus 380s. In fact, over 500 kilometers of it, which is quite staggering in itself. So I was encouraged to make a change, and I thought that was pretty fine. So I'd do that, and so I kind of headed off in a slightly tangential direction, and it led me to consider aircraft frames rather than wire, and as we all know, aircraft frames are made of aluminium, but they're not. That's when I learned about duralumin. Next slide. So this is an aluminium copper alloy, which is developed, well, it was developed slightly earlier than this by a metallurgist, Alfred Wilm, at Duralumin Metalwerk, which is was a big metal combine in Düren in the Ruhr. And it came, as it were, onto the market about 6 years after he'd developed this in 1903. And interestingly, I'm glad Charles is here, he didn't patent it. So it's been very, very widely used, or either he or the company didn't patent it. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. It's an aluminium copper alloy, a lot of aluminium, not much copper. So I put Duralumin into the Delcamp search, and immediately I got a meter cover from the company itself. It's not the best meter cover, but there it was waiting for me. It didn't cost me a lot of money, so that's good. This is a wormhole which I need to go down a bit further. Oh yeah, next please. So I learned that the company didn't take out a patent for whatever reason, and it became extremely widely used around the world. But one of the first adopters was the Junkers Aircraft Corporation, and they made a major use of it in aircraft construction. And that enabled me to buy lots of stamps of Junkers aeroplanes, and that's kind of a rather nice postal stationery card. And very recently on our club packet, I got this little miniature sheet from Danzig. So you probably have seen those kind of rather boxy planes from the 1930s that have the corrugated siding. I think they appeared in those Indiana Jones films. So very much a 1930s thing. And so I learned, and this is something I haven't kind of quite worked out. So they built these aircraft frames of duralumin, and it's much stronger than aluminium. It's exceptionally light, but it corrodes. And I would have thought at that point they would have given up on it, but for some reason they didn't. But if you coat it with aluminium, it doesn't corrode. So I'm not enough of a metallurgist to quite understand why that happens. But so we have aluminium-clad airlines, or AL-clad airplanes, which we still use today, and they cover an airframe which is made of duralumin. So far so good. Next slide. And then I learned that it was used in the Zeppelins. Not only just the Zeppelins, but almost all the airships which were built in the 1930s. So it was a really big metal big metal alloy between the two world wars. Quite quickly, I picked up this wonderful postcard of the Graf Zeppelin LS-127 with the airframe under construction in its hangar. Thought, this is good. There's duralumin in real life, as it were. And I thought, well, I need, of course, to get a Zeppelin cover if I'm going to use this in an exhibition. And there are so many, and I didn't really know which one to get. Preferably one that's not horrendously expensive, but one that showed some interesting postal markings, and also illustrated the Zeppelin itself, because that's would be the point of using it in a thematic exhibit. So I came across one from the Polar Flight, which is one of the more celebrated flights of that very same Zeppelin, which was pictured there in the hangar. Late July 1931. So it was there were 5 legs to it, set off from Frederikshavn, where they all set off from. It's got the nice postal marking for Berlin, and then it's got the Leningrad postal mark, and then it's got, of course, the cachets. So, you know, it was a piece of mail, highly philatelic, of course. If people started producing this kind of stuff today, we'd say, no way. But Zeppelin collectors know otherwise. So it was a scientific exhibition, and it was also to demonstrate the ability of airships under extreme conditions. And it was a multi-national group of scientists who made meteorological observations. They measured the Earth's magnetic field as they kind of flew up to the pole. They did a photographic survey from cameras affixed to the Zeppelin of those unmapped regions of, you know, northern Russia and so on. You know, they proved that the thing could fly in that kind of atmosphere, and that it could actually carry quite a heavy payload. So, and it's a nice little philatelic item. Whether it gets used in the revision of the exhibit is, you know, anybody's guess. But it is a bit of a wormhole. Next, please. And so this alloy had a number of uses in the 1930s and 1940s. You can get lots and lots of adverts for it, not just from Germany, such as this one advertising this alloy, which can be used for airplanes and cars and motor vehicles and so on, from the same company that developed it in the first place. But there are lots of adverts from France. It was used extensively in France and Italy in terms of the aircraft in between the two world wars that were manufactured there. It was used extensively in Britain as well, and there are lots of adverts of from magazines of using duralumin for aircraft and other things. It was used for motor vehicles. It was used a lot for bicycle components, particularly frames, but more so the pedals and so on, because those were quite heavy compared to the frames. It's used by all the very best cyclists in the Tour de France and so on. It's lots of machine components, frames for glasses. There we go. Your countries. So that's what happens when you don't patent something. The name is very popular. It's basically a trade name, and I've got my Wikipedia up here. It says its use as a trade name is obsolete, and clearly I'm going to show you that it's not, because nowadays the scientific community uses, or the industrial community has a series of metal alloys under the interesting title of the 2000 series, such as 2011 and 2014 and 2017 and 2024, and there are many more. Basically, the use in aircraft is alloy 2014 and 2024. So earlier this year, I purchased next please. I purchased from Blacks a nice walking pole. And I was in Greece walking up some rocky terrain, and I managed to break it because I was really not using it in the proper way. And so I brought it back with me because it was only about 2 weeks old. And that's my replacement walking frame. And as you extend that walking frame out, on it says duralumin. So the trade name is not obsolete at all. There we go. That's it.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. That's great. Thank you very much. Okay. The next person up is Wendy, talking about Gutenberg, if I've pronounced it right.
I don't speak German either. Let's go for Gutenberg. Okay, right. Johannes Gutenberg is known as the person who invented printing in the West. But the point about it for this evening is that so little is known about him. It's something that can be covered in really just a few slides. He didn't actually invent printing as such. That was invented in the Far East. China started it from the 9th century, first of all using carved wooden blocks, and then later using movable type from the 11th century. Korea started using it, and printing in movable type was known in Korea from the 14th century. And there's a rather nice slide here on the right showing these were actually carved ceramic letters. But none of that knowledge was known in the West. So next slide, please. As I say, for all his major invention, what we know is from 3 or 4 pieces of legal records that have been left and can be summed up very quickly. He was born in Mainz sometime between 1393 and 1406. His parents were important merchants in Mainz, but they had to leave the city in the 1420s at a time of civil disturbance. And it's known that he was in Strasbourg in 1434, and he was working on various projects, and probably one of them was printing, but there's no documentary evidence about it. He's known to have been back in Mainz by 1448, and at that point, he borrowed a very large sum of money to continue his researches into what he was trying to do. And then in 1455, there's a document from a Mainz notary based on oaths sworn before him concerning a financial dispute between Gutenberg and Johann Fust, who was his partner and his financier, it seems, resulting from the work they've been doing on a Bible. Gutenberg lost the lawsuit. After that, he got into serious financial difficulty, and in 1458, he defaulted on debts that he'd previously been paying off regularly. And at that point, he stopped printing. He never printed anything again in his life. He did have a slightly happier last few years. He was granted a pension by the Prince Archbishop of Mainz and died in 1468. It's thought that he was buried in a church in Mainz, but that has long disappeared, as has the graveyard. So there is no grave to remember him by either. Next slide, please. So what did he look like? Well, we don't know that either. There's only one portrait of him, and that's the André Thevet portrait, but that was done in 1584, which is well over 100 years after his death. So all that can safely be said is that historians tend to think that actually he probably didn't have a beard, and that's about as much as anybody knows. But you can see from that slide that a lot of countries have used that slide as a starting point for their design for commemorative stamps. Next slide, please. So, as I said, he didn't invent printing and he didn't invent movable type, but he came up with the ideas completely independently of anything that had gone on before in the East. And it was actually a huge invention. The first thing he had to do was work out how to make movable type. And he designed matrices which were made of brass. Those were used to cast individual letters. He then needed to work out an ink that would adhere equally well both to paper or vellum and to the metal itself. So that had to be redesigned. And of course, he needed a printing press. And that was probably the easiest bit, because there were plenty of printing presses in existence, wine and oil presses particularly. And he came up with this screw and lever principle, which applied pressure from the type to the paper or to the vellum. And that design stayed largely unchanged for several hundred years. Next slide, please. The major work for which he's remembered is what's now called the Gutenberg Bible, or sometimes called the 42-line Bible, because it's got 42 lines to the page. It was the first major book printed in the West, and it was produced in collaboration with Johann Fust. 135 copies were printed on paper, 45 copies printed on vellum, but there's only 48 copies known to have survived, and only 20 of those are complete. There are 2 in this country in the British Library, in fact. It was printed sometime between 1453 and 1455. And as I say, as far as anyone knows, that is the last thing that he ever printed. Next slide, please. As I said, he lost a lawsuit brought by Fust, and a result of which he was never involved again. But Fust himself did continue the business with Peter Schoeffer, who was one of Gutenberg's craftsmen, and Schoeffer made money where Gutenberg had failed. He survived in business until his death in 1502, and Schoeffer's business flourished for many more years after that. And it was very soon after Gutenberg's death that people began to realize just how important this invention was. Next slide, please. The legacy really was huge. The technical improvements in printing resulted in, first of all, newspapers and then magazines being printed in huge numbers, to the point where by the 20th century, we all know what size of printing was and how many hundreds, millions of copies of things could be printed. And it's generally reckoned the invention probably had the single greatest effect on the spread of knowledge until the invention of the World Wide Web, which really has had a very similar impact in as much as that it has democratized knowledge and information, making it available cheaply to many more people than had been known before. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks, Wendy. That was good. Next up, we have Mike, Napoleon on St Helena. All yours, Mike.
Thanks very much. This is very much a work in progress, but I think I've included all the stamps, excuse me, that have been issued by St Helena. Although I'm starting here about Napoleon first setting foot in Jamestown in October 1815, there's a picture of Jamestown 1857 or earlier. I'd just like to make a few comments about how he actually got there in the first place. He had attempted to get to America, but he found his attempts thwarted by the Royal Navy, so he surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon on the 15th of July 1815. It seems that Napoleon expected that he'd be allowed to settle in England. The British, not entirely happy from him escaping from Elba, had decided that was impossible. So they decided on St Helena, which is 1,200 miles from Africa. Napoleon was somewhat shocked at this. The thing I found rather strange was that Napoleon didn't really seem to make too much of an effort to escape and avoid the Navy. I mean, Maitland himself sent a letter to Admiral Keith, and in that he said that he was a little, well, he thought an escape would have been possible, even probable. Had Napoleon known he was actually going to be going to St Helena, he probably made bigger efforts to go. Whilst at Plymouth, small boats will come out in the evening, sort of for the passengers to see if they get glimpses of Napoleon. He appeared on the deck at about 6 o'clock most evenings, and Napoleon was introduced to Maitland's wife, Catherine. She came out in a boat to see her husband. Napoleon was then transferred to HMS Northumberland under the command of Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn for the trip to St Helena. If we go to the next page, please. Napoleon didn't go on his own. These people accompanied him. One odd thing was the British would always refer to him as a general, the French always as an emperor. Next page, please. This is a set of stamps issued in 1996. Top left is a place where Napoleon stayed on his first night, Mr. Porteous's guest house. What have I done next? The Briars Pavilion is top right. That's where Napoleon stayed for about, I think it was October, December, as Longwood House was being prepared for him. It was a bit of a shambles before he arrived, and from what I understand, it was a bit of a shambles after he was installed there. So Longwood House is bottom left, and the site of his grave is bottom right. The willow trees, I think, are long gone. Next one, please. The Briars. This is where Napoleon stayed after his first night in Mr. Porteous's house until the 10th of December, when he moved to Longwood House. Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, had stayed in the pavilion for a few days during 1805, whilst returning home from India. Next, please. A set of stamps was issued during 2009, showing the Briars Pavilion, top and bottom. Now, this was purchased by Dame Mabel Brooks, a member of the Balcombe family, and it was the Balcombes who occupied the house, and she presented that to the French government. When Napoleon arrived on the island, the Briars was occupied by Mr. William Balcombe, an agent of the East India Company, his wife and daughters, one of whom, Betsy, became a very good friend of Napoleon. Betsy was I think about 14 at the time, and you can see them together in the middle stamp. Balcombe became responsible for Napoleon's provisions. Next one, please. What do you got? Oh, these are just a couple of pictures of Longwood. I don't know how before 1857, but they came from a book published in 1857, and there's a stamp top right-hand corner of Longwood House. Please, next. How did Napoleon occupy his time? His main interest was in the garden. Now, in this stamp here, we see his the arrival at Jamestown, top left, middle left, Longwood House, bottom left, Napoleon in his garden, top right, dictating his memoirs, the death of Napoleon, middle right, and his grave. Rosebery here says that his main interest was in the garden. And apart from gardening, he rode, read, and dictated, and that seems to be really all he did. Going back to the Balkans, which I didn't mention, they left in 1818. The then governor, Hudson Lowe, suspected Balkham of sending secret messages from Napoleon. So rather than sort of get arrested and sort of perhaps charged with treason, Balkham decided the best thing was to get out of the country, which he did. Next one, please. The death of Napoleon, surrounded by his suite, and I think some British officers as well. I think the official cause of death was stomach cancer. I know there are lots of theories about how he died, but not going to go into that here. Next one, please. This really is Napoleon's tomb. There's a stamp up there showing it. This is again sort of 1857, so it's before 1857. So it would have probably looked like it did when Napoleon was there. A couple of stamps were issued during 1971 on the 150th anniversary of his death. One showing himself on St Helena, and the other after David's painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Next, please. Although Napoleon was buried on the island, his remains were repatriated to France during 1840. This set of stamps was issued during December 1990. Then they were transferred via the frigate La Belle Poule, the Beautiful Hen, from St Helena to Cherbourg, and then they were eventually interred in the dome in Les Invalides, Paris. Next, please, and I think the final one. This was a set of stamps issued during 2008. The French government heard, or Napoleon III heard, that Longwood House and his tomb were falling into disrepair. So they negotiated with the British government to purchase both the house and the area of the tomb. And in May 1858, the first curator of the properties, with the title of Commander of the Imperial Residences of Selina, was installed. Hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly, but that's it.
That was grand, Mike. That was most interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Next we have Jean.
Good evening. Most of you know I collect supermarket philately, and I have the next slide, please. And this is one of my latest cards I got, and it's nice to have thought a picture of the Queen, or rather the late Queen. Now, unfortunately, it said National Blend Coffee from Dearborn and Company, which I wasn't able to find, but it was from Canada, and it was impossible to find. And it's also a little bit out of date because my collection goes from 1971 to 2000. And this actually was produced a little bit earlier. Next slide, please. A century earlier, because the picture given away is that of Queen Victoria. And here you can see that if you bought Dearborn coffee, you could get a picture of Queen Victoria. And the card cancelled, it's 1900, that's just before she died, so the photograph was probably taken just about then. I don't know how many people ever got a photograph of the late Queen, or whether they kept them, or if there are any in existence. Next slide, please. But I did a little bit of hunting and I got as near as I could. And this was a photograph from the Richmond Library. Next slide, please. And you can see how similar. They must have been taken within minutes of the picture that was being given away. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Jean.
You nearly caught me on the hop there. Thank you very much. Okay, Anne, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. This is just a bit about amethyst and one sheet of tanzanite. Some of you may know I used to collect gemstones, but had to cut my collection down to just gold at the moment. Now, amethyst gets its name from Greek amethysto, which means not drunk. And it's believed to guard against drunkenness. Next slide, please. This postcard shows you amethyst, but it also shows you citrine, which is the middle row of gemstones there, B and C. And amethyst, when heated, will change to this yellow-brown color and is sometimes mistaken for citrine. The amethyst on the left shows the sort of crystal structure, which we will see later on as well. It's a member of the quartz family, and it's often found in volcanic rock in the crevices. Next slide, please. There's the prismatic crystals on this Russian cover. And the color mauve comes from iron. You will often see amethyst in a geode form, which is the bottom stamp. That's how people often have it in their sitting rooms and things. And it's been known for many, many hundreds, millions of years as the Egyptians used it. Now, amethyst may be one of the stones that we should have in our houses because it has a lot of myths around it. And they appertain to your mental health, apparently, which is terribly vogue at the moment. It's meant to be good for mental stability. And it also protects you against psychic attacks. And it is also good for romance. So it has a lot of powerful things about it that I think we don't really know about. So next slide, please. Now, it's found really in Brazil at the moment. Russia used to have it a lot, but it's now Brazil that is the country where you get the best amethysts. And amethyst will go from very pale, sort of lilac mauve, to a really deep color, which are the best amethysts. It used to be only kept for the royalty and noblemen that could have it, and then priests and spiritual leaders were allowed to have it as well. Now, of course, anybody can have amethyst. It's a very popular semi-precious stone used in jewelry and also as just pebbles of the gem. It used to also come from Uruguay and North America. In really early times, it was used in Egypt and also in Mesopotamia. And they used to make it into cylindrical seals for religious purposes because they could carve into it. Today, it's mostly cut as or faceted into a gemstone. It's faceted is when it's cut and you can see the cuts. Sometimes it's a cabochon, which is like a very smooth stone set into a gold or silver setting. Next slide, please. Here we have just a registered couple from East Germany who also have a very important mining college, which is still there. These two covers are appertaining to that, as you can see. Next slide, please. There's a shipping line which is called, or it was called, the Gem Line, and there were 4 ships. There was Amethyst, Sapphire, Emerald, and Aquamarine. And here you've got an example of an entire that was transported by the Amethyst ship. Next slide, please. There's one thing, when I said it prevented drunkenness, that's reason that bishops often have an amethyst ring, because it's to prevent them becoming drunk. Which, there we go. We've mentioned that it's also a stone that used to be used for nobility and royalty. And the Queen, the late Queen, when she was crowned, you may remember her beautiful coronation dress, which depicted the 4 nations' flowers, including the thistle, the Scottish thistle. And it is, you can see it on the dress, and it was actually made with amethyst gemstones and silk, so that the gemstones were raised from the fabric. And of course, it would catch the light when she was walking. Next slide, please. Now, tanzanite can sometimes be mistaken for amethyst, because some tanzanite in a certain light will look very similar. It's a much rarer gemstone. It's only found in Tanzania, and it will change color. I have a little pair of earrings of tanzanite. Sometimes they look brown, sometimes blue, and sometimes purple. So it is a very unusual gemstone. It's quite rare, but you can buy jewelry made from it. I think that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's most interesting. And I assure you, I don't have any amethyst here in the building whatsoever.
Well, there you go.
Okay, Peter, you're on.
Right, thank you. Right, well, Dr Barnardo, who I expect we've all heard of, born in Dublin, hence my original interest. Very briefly, his family wealth, I think, or well, such as it was, they were furriers, which is a sort of non-EU trade to be in nowadays. But anyway, and there was an evangelical event in 1862 in Dublin, and he was most impressed by this, and but not converted, but enthusiastic, and decided to become a medical missionary. And as we say there, he came then to London to train to be a medical missionary for China. And as a fervent Christian, in your spare time, he helped out at an East End ragged school. This is where the youngsters from poor backgrounds, because no national schools at that stage, would be taught. And while doing this, he realized in what poverty they were living. And it wasn't just teaching, which is best to do, but they actually needed more care than this. And that's where he started looking after the children, orphans, destitute, well, boys initially, and that hence the Dr Barnardo's homes, etc. Now, when one comes to doing a thematic, there's a slight problem, because as far as I know, he's never appeared on a stamp. That postcard does appear on something, and I couldn't, at the time, I couldn't find it. And as I've been disposing of some of my Ireland collections, I thought it long gone. But that postcard itself does appear on a item of postal stationery that was made in the 1990s for the stamper International Exhibition in Dublin. The embossed stamp is somebody else, but on the rest of the card they do show that postcard. But anyway, that's the only way he's there philatelically. So you've got to show him some other way, and one is that meter mark on the other side, and I quite like that because it's a proving one for that meter mark of N165 is for Barnardo's homes because it's on one of his envelopes. Now, whether they were ever used, I mean, the marvelous one would be to find one of those on a blank envelope and be able to say, oh, I know that's Dr. Barnardo's homes. But anyway, I think that's probably wanting the impossible. So I'm happy enough with that one. So next slide, please. Thank you. And here's another one. Well, this is a horrible looking thing, isn't it? The only, the date range is purely because of the stamp. That's just a wrapper, open-ended at both ends. And what I suspect, who knows, is that this is being sent out probably in December to somebody who they've got their address, they gave money before, and it's got a report about what we've done in the last year, as the charities do. They say, look what your funds are doing. We're helping 8,000 boys or whatever it is. And so please give us a Christmas donation. Do you keep those wrappers and that blurb? No, you don't. Whether you give a donation or not, you don't keep them. So so I imagine, although there were thousands of those produced, they're probably quite rare, but so it's tatty, but there you go. Totally undated, but so I'm quite pleased with it. Next slide, please. And where you can get is slogan postmarks. So they did one for the centenary at the top there, 100 years. And then later on, there were two other ones, later dates, with this new logo. And those are slightly different. I had them written up for years, just saying one's in the transposed position, showing the slogan clearly. And one shows the date clearly. But they are slightly different, I've realized now, so it's a bit more searching. The one at the top has a slightly personal connection, insofar as Stourbridge was the home of my grandparents, and of course for one thing, and so that is when, as a youngster, at a certain point, postmarks were coming in, weren't they? I think the famous one, wasn't it, ready for your invasion at Hastings? It was all in the stamp mags about now. Slogan postmarks are available, and so I started collecting those instead of stamps, and I've cut that off a letter from my grandmother to my mother, and I've kept that one. I haven't kept anything else I did then, but because of the inverted 1966. But Stourbridge, it's a personal connection, that one. Anyway, next slide. Next. Thank you. And the other place, and again, this is ideal because they come through the letterbox to you for nothing. You just cut off the strip. Is the other place you can show this, and they are allowable in thematics, we're told, is these PPIs or bulk posting systems. There's a couple of different ones from Britain, and there's one from Ireland, and it's Cadunis, and if anybody speaks Irish, they'll laugh at my pronunciation, I believe, but seeing as I was never taught how to pronounce Irish at school, I do my best. I think it just means serial number because it's the, well, I won't try IOPTA or whatever, that means paid. So that's their version of a PPI in Ireland. Okay. So next slide, please. And now we get, this is the danger, isn't it? Once you get away from strict philatelic things, oh dear. So we get to matchbook covers. They didn't all, who knows where they turn up. But anyway, so I think by looking at the designs, I mean, I reckon when they're helping 7,000, that's the late 50s, is it, or early 60s? Boy and a girl on back and front, two versions. Then in 1966, like the slogan postmark, there's a centenary one. And then we get to the new logo of boy and girl in hand in a circle there. That's probably 70s, is it, or 80s? And 8,000 are being helped. So that's my guess anyway, but who knows? Has anyone done a listing of matchbook covers? Next slide, please. What have we got to now? Again, all plonked on one page. You think, oh, isn't this marvelous? Of course, these are turned up, 30 years apart or whatever. But Mrs. Barnardo's lectures at the bottom, this is after his death, 3 years after his death. She obviously toured the country, still raising funds for his, for the homes, jolly good. But 2 days apart, perhaps people know Yorkshire better than I, but at York, it cost 1 and 6 to hear a talk. And at Harrogate, it cost 6pence. I'd have thought it might be the other way around, but there you go. And then in 1916, there's a performance being given by Dr. Barnardo's musical boys. And so during the war, of course, but anyway, so no doubt part of the education was music and forming a band or concerts and doing that, learning to do their turns and all this sort of thing. And so that's interesting one. Anyway, next slide, please. And then we're getting a bit away from philately, but this, by the way, is on tissue paper, or it's very, very delicate. This is so crisp and clean. I think you can see it was, by the time I got it, it's been kept folded up, probably ever since the person went in about 1916 to one of their concerts. And this is what you bought. This was your program. And so it's about, well, a bit less than a foot square, 10 inch, whatever, 10, 11 inch square or something, on real tissue paper. It was hell to try and, it's not mounted on the thing, but I've put it into a protector so it can be displayed. And so one wondered about this sort of thing, but my last one is nothing to do with, if we perhaps switch to the next slide now, because here, this is nothing to do with Barnardo, but it's another of these things, about a foot square, a bit less, on very fine tissue paper. And this one has got a name on it. It's produced by Mrs. Sarah Burgess. Sorry, you can't read it. And the reason I've got this one is I was at an ephemera fair and somebody had some of these pinned up. And fortunately, he knew, well, not fortunately, he could tell me a bit about them. And I bought one off him. I thought I ought to. And I haven't enlarged it, because you see bottom left there, the picturesque Irish village at the Franco-British exhibition. So it does fit in my Irish theme. And this is a bit of working class culture in the year early Edwardian, I suppose, 1900 to 1910, that these were produced and collected as a working class things. There's two ways, and two ways of looking at it, I think. Firstly, there's, if people remember when I used, going to sports events or pop events or whatever, certainly when I was doing that, 60s, 70s, often you used to get pirate programs. Before you got to the event, someone was, oh, buy a program, buy a program. When you got there, you found you'd been conned because it was a fake one, wasn't it? It wasn't the real thing. But in this time, it's slightly different. If you're going to the Franco-British exhibition as a working class person, it's all you can do to manage to pay your 3pence or 6pence to get in. You're not going to pay a shilling for a program, God's sake, but you'll pay a penny for one of those outside as a souvenir. So that's where it started. And so obviously that's what it was doing at these events. And or at the Lord Mayor's show. That's what this guy had. He had a lot for the Lord Mayor's show for different years. But seeing he was asking for lots of money for them, I wasn't going to start a collection of these. Anyway, that's basically Dr. Barnardo and with a bow to working class culture of the early 20th century.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much. Okay, John, you're up next and the last one, I believe.
Oh, thanks, Barry. Yeah. So this is just something very silly to finish on. As you may know from previous talks, I've been clearing through a load of stuff that my dad had accumulated over a number of years, including a couple of old style stamp albums, and these are the covers of them, which were we had quite a lot of these, and they were incredibly poor condition. They were falling apart. The pages were coming loose. So we embarked on a bit of a salvage job with them to try and rescue what stamps we could out of them. And as we were sorting through, we noticed something quite interesting. So you'll have seen this kind of album page where you get some printed stamps at the top of the page related to the countries on the page. And my wife handed me this. She said, look at this. And there, mounted below the image of the Rhodesia and Nyasaland halfpence, was a Rhodesia and Nyasaland halfpence. So we thought, well, that's funny. And she put it to one side as a quirky thing, because she knows I like quirky things. And I went off to do something, I can't remember what, and left her sorting out some stuff. And when I came back, I discovered that she'd found tons of these. She'd found 2 different album pages with a Sarawak stamp printed on, and then also the stamp mounted just below them. She'd found a Gold Coast penny, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, 10 cents. And just in case we thought, well, this is only Commonwealth stamps, we can clearly see what's going on here. There was a Bolivia. I think that's 30 centavos. I'm not exactly sure, but there was a Bolivian stamp as well. So this is obviously somebody has either been given an album with a packet of stamps in and the stamps match what's going on, or it's just a quirk, but it just seemed very funny to us. I have noticed that these are all very cheap stamps, like they were like the 1 cent or the 1 penny or whatever. They weren't anything major. And then, then we had a near miss. Look at this. That's the St Kitts, Nevis and Anguilla half cents mounted below the 1 cent. And that was just frustrating, but I've included it for completeness, just so you can all sense my pain. And then a couple of other things. I'm so annoyed by this San Marino example. Look, they've mounted the stamp at the bottom of the page when they could have mounted it right underneath it, and it would have looked so much neater. And then this is the other thing that my wife handed to me. She said, look at that. And on this rather tatty Poland page, printed on the top, is a stamp that would go in my normal collection, because that is the stamp that Poland issued commemorating the US Constitution, 150 years, with the Statue of Liberty and the New York skyline in silhouette in the background. But unfortunately, this is another near miss, because the stamp is nowhere to be seen on the page. It does leave me with a challenge, though. I'm going to start looking through all these tatty old stamp albums when I see them at stamp fairs. If I see they've got printed headers, I'm on a quest now to try and find one that has a Statue of Liberty stamp printed on the page and mounted on the page. That's my new quest, because I like doing impossible things. So that's matching headers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. But I think that was all fantastic, all 7 of you. Thank you very much indeed. And could we show our appreciation in the usual manner? Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Oh, great stuff.
yes, yeah.